Nikhil Krishnaswamy is going to present. And the name of the title of the paper is Neurosymbolic AI for Situated Language Understanding. So Nikhil, if I could have you begin sharing whenever you're.
Here we go. Okay, let's see. Can you see the slides now?
Yeah.
Very slowly, okay. And can you also see, I'm gonna play some videos. Can you see this window here? Okay.
Yes.
I'm gonna take that for yes. Okay, thank you. So yeah, my name is Nikhil Krishnaswamy. I'm an assistant professor at Colorado State University. I'm presenting work here that was done during my PhD and postdoc at Brandeis University with my co-author and colleague, James Pustejovsky. So NLP, of course, has made some great strides in recent years. We've seen pipelines for NLP mature in many tasks, from speech recognition to tokenization to parsing, and more. This was really kicked off in the last decade due to the deep learning revolution, and we see sophisticated systems in question answering, chatbots, and text generation, et cetera. Now in 2020, we have a number of well-handled pipelines that people can use to perform some fairly sophisticated NLP tasks. One example is this GPT-2 enabled text generation, where I put in the bolded text is the first sentence of the Wikipedia article on natural language processing, which the transformer architecture then completes. And if you read it, it's syntactic. It mostly makes sense. It's largely correct. It might talk about NLP in a way that a non-expert might. But if an average human wrote this, I actually would not be that surprised. So if things are so good, what's left? So I invite you to try something with your smartphone or your smart speaker or some device. Ask Siri or Alexa, what am I pointing at? And you'll get a variety of answers, such as interesting question, or you're a great person to talk to, because these devices don't actually have the machinery to understand the full situation that you inhabit to answer that question. So thanks to big data, we have high-performing NLP, and thanks to compute power, we have these usable interactive systems, many of which have NLP capability in them. But all these systems exist in a situated context, and the very word situation implies alternate modalities of description, such as configurations, deictic reference, object properties, et cetera. And these systems typically lack the ability to validate cross-modally or the background knowledge necessary to handle things like the situation in which they actually inhabit. So how do you interface with these devices if scenarios such as what am I pointing at fails? This talk covers work over the last approximately 5 years that's directed toward answering this question, so there's a lot of stuff to get into. So robust communicative interaction between humans and computers requires the following capabilities: recognition and generation within multiple modalities, understanding of contextual grounding and co-situatedness in conversation, and all parties must appreciate the consequences of actions taken throughout the dialogue. Central to all these is the notion of semantically grounding the concept to a situation, and certain modalities are better at grounding certain types of information, such as pointing to specific locations, or language for attributives or concept labels. However, grounding in NLP often refers to a type of multimodal linking where you have a caption and maybe some bounding boxes in the image, or a caption of the image such as this one on the right that says it's a group of young children playing a game of soccer, when in fact it's a young girl about to go to town on her father's face with a golf club. So what is the computer missing that we as humans understand is going on? Situated grounding entails knowledge of entities in context, such as what a golf club is for and the type of ball it might interact with, and the ability to recognize people in certain positions. And current data doesn't really solve this problem, because what we need is context, conversational, situational, et cetera. And encoding of context tends to be hit or miss. Language models may have billions of parameters, including GPT-3 with its 175 billion, more on that later. But for a particular task, billions of those parameters could be not quite right. So human reasoning is sensitive to contextual models, and I do a lot of DARPA work, and DARPA has this term, the 3 waves of AI. As applied to contextual representation, here's my take on it. The first wave of AI, as you all know, lots of logical symbolic models of context. In practice, this may be a lot of if statements. Sorry, I have a co-author approaching my screen and meowing. And the second wave of AI is typically probabilistic learning of context, which is usually realized as data-intensive vector similarity. The third wave of AI I like to call structured learned contextual representation. And the term Neurosymbolic AI came up a lot at this year's AAAI, including 3 talks by Yal McCune, David Cox, and Henry Kautz. that touched on some questions that I've been considering for a long time, such as what are the analytic units and the structure of context? So take this interaction where there's this mother and son engaged in a task of washing dishes. There's a common ground that emerges between them as they interact, including the agents involved and the terms used to discuss them, the beliefs, desires, and intentions of those agents, and the objects involved and the terms used to discuss them, and the totality, the embedding space within which the action takes place. I want to focus on objects for a section. The context of objects is described by their properties, and the object properties cannot really be decoupled from the events they facilitate. This goes back to the theory of affordances by James Gibson. So if we take two utterances, such as a cup sliding across the table or rolling across the table, you imagine that cup being in certain orientations and certain consequences associated with that, such as liquid spilling out or not. We developed this modeling language, VoxML, to capture some of this. VoxML is a modeling language designed to capture common sense object and event semantics. And it has a particular focus on habitats, which are conditioning environments that affect object affordances or behaviors attached due to the object structure or purpose. This is ontological information that's often difficult to learn from corpora because it's so common that people often don't feel the need to discuss it. This is one such encoding, a VoxML encoding for a cup that shows some habituated knowledge of object properties. You can see it's a cylindroid object, it's concave, it has some symmetry information, and some affordances. This is by no means complete, but you can say if you put something in the cup, then the cup's going to contain that object. Human understanding depends on a wealth of such common sense knowledge because humans perform much reasoning qualitatively. However, to computationally simulate events, every parameter has to have a value or the program isn't going to run. So if I say roll the ball, the computer must know how fast or in which direction. If I say roll the cup, the computer has to know this might only be possible in a certain orientation. VoxML captures a formal semantic encoding of the properties of objects, events, attributes, relations, and functions. And in work leading up to my dissertation, we developed a piece of software called VoxSim that's designed to examine what situated grounding can do. And we found that it exploits the numerical information demanded by 3D visualization, perform qualitative reasoning about objects and events, and capture semantic context that's often overlooked by unimodal language processing. There are multiple meanings of simulation that this brings together, including the parameter setting and testing and the computational models, such as models of physical systems, virtual embodied interactions, such as video games, and then the idea of language comprehension via mental simulations or the embodied theory of mind. In my dissertation, I brought all these three together into Monte Carlo simulation of underspecified motion predicates. The process of that looks something like this. You take an input and parse it and extract the events and objects with all their VoxML properties. These are then recomposed, and that recomposition is going to leave certain features underspecified depending on the object and the event, such as speed of motion, direction of motion, etc. This is fed to a neural network that's trained over 35,000 human annotated visualizations of various motion events. The output of that neural net is variable values for those underspecified features that are then resituated and executed in context. So you're going to get a visualization of a particular instantiation of a cup sliding that someone can then look at and say, yes, that's a cup sliding, or no, it's not. So for this, we only had objects moving in isolation. But if you really want to examine situatedness in situated context, it has to be between two agents that have that same type of situated embodiment. So we created a virtual person to model multimodal dialogue, and this is Diana, an interactive agent. We'll see a lot more of her later. I'll play a brief video clip right now. Can everybody hear the video?
No audio.
No audio, okay. So I'm making some gestures to... Can anybody hear this now?
Got it.
Yes.
Do that and I'll
Okay.
grasp the plate like this.
So I'm making some gestures to indicate how she should grasp the plate, and then she can use that action to grasp the plate again by making that one single gesture, after which she will then execute actions over the items.
Okay.
The knife.
Okay.
Grab it.
And the same thing can repeat for different objects.
Should I grasp it like
I can
this?
indicate different types of grasp poses through which she should grasp the object.
Is there a gesture for that?
And you probably get the idea about how
Please.
this works. So by having learned this correlated instruction, I can use a single gesture to instruct the avatar to grab an object in a particular fashion. We use a continuation passing style semantics that allows us to take these reusable associations and fill in other action sequences. So here is a slide event that has grasp as a sub-event. And if the agent encounters some context containing an action with an outstanding variable, and I supply the gesture for grasp plate, then the agent can directly lift grasp plate to the argument to fill in the slide event. And here is an example of that. So we see the similar process.
Should I grasp it like this?
When I make an action, she goes directly to
Is there
learn
a
the
gesture
gesture.
for that?
And then she continues with the action. Process for that looks something like this, where we have an object affordance that is currently being interacted with by the agent. This creates an incomplete affordance semantics. At the same time, when she asks, is there a gesture for that, Connect depth camera captures the visual features of what the hand is doing at that point. It's then fed into a random forest trained over 8 hours of annotated video data with 34 known gestures. This new gesture is then situated within that search space, which fills in that variable in the affordance semantics with the pose. That's then propagated down to any other events that contain that, in this case, grasp event as a sub-event. So proceeding from affordances to configurations, we have an intuition that if you take the resultant states that come from exploiting affordances, you can use that to create configurations of objects. So for instance, if you have a moving truck full of boxes, you can exploit the stackability of boxes to put all your objects in a confined space. If you're a bird trying to figure out how to hold 2 donuts, you can exploit the way you can stack 2 donuts together and then hold one in order to hold them both at the same time. However, this is a more complex problem than learning affordances over single objects. And so because of the complexity of composing individual affordances, we test and back off to a simpler domain where we can reuse them. We still have some problems. Different constraints matter in different configurations. So if I'm building a place setting, the particular configuration of the object matters. I must put the plate in the center. If I'm loading a moving truck or holding donuts, it's really more the overall configuration of the object that matters. Second problem is we need representative data to train on, and the one-shot gesture learning uses random forests over these huge feature vectors from 8 hours of data, and we don't have equivalent data for structure learning in our virtual environment. But we did have some data where we constructed a user study a couple of years ago, where 20 naive users collaborated with Diana to build a 3-step staircase. And the results were pretty diverse, where we had some very canonical staircases like the one on the left, and some that had spaces in between them, rotated blocks, etc. But at least one user described the structure as a staircase. And so we tried to see if we could create an algorithm to infer and reproduce commonalities across this small and noisy sample. We extracted qualitative relations directly from the situated environment, such as left, touching, etc. These are subsets of the region connection calculus and various other calculi from the QSR library. Where necessary, we used 3D variants or computed axial overlap with the separating hyperplane theorem for 3D objects. A learning configuration was outlined in this paper from last year's AAAI. It looks something like this. Given the sample configuration and a set of objects to place, you place an object, look at where you are and predict using a CNN which known example you may be approaching, then predict the remaining set of moves required to get there using an LSTM. Choose the best move out of those options and then repeat until out of objects. And then once you're done, you have a couple of examples and you try to infer constraints over them. This relies on a significant intuition such that when you're doing our classification, we assume that when you have only a couple of objects on the table, it's going to be very noisy. There are a number of places you could end up and a number of ways to get there. When you have most of your objects placed, it should be pretty clear where you're going and what you need to do to arrive there. So we validated this by feeding longer and longer relation sets into the CNN and LSTM architectures, and then just computed the loss after a certain amount of training. And as expected, the loss attenuates and we approach 0 as we get closer to completing the structure, which is what you would expect for a task like this. We chose 5 heuristics to assess for which select the best moves toward the goal state. Use random chance as a baseline, Jacquard distance for presence or absence of shared relations, Levenstein distance because the count also matters. We also used a graph matcher developed by a colleague, Scott Friedman, called Spire, and then we adapted a version of the graph matcher to also prune some of the results by Levenstein distance before feeding them to the graph matcher. We fed our results to annotators and had them evaluate the structures that the agent built on a scale of 0 to 10. And then the images were viewed in random order, and we assessed the standard deviation of the average scores per structure generated using the heuristic, where lower standard deviation should indicate greater overall evaluator agreement. Here are some results where we can see some staircases that displayed the desired inferences, and here's a GIF of what the agent would do with a final sequence to actually build a structure that was then evaluated. So this chart shows we generated 50 structures, 5 per heuristic. This chart shows the median and highest scored structure generated using each heuristic with evaluator score 0 through 10. The graph matcher was the best performing heuristic compared to a baseline score of 2.0. And then we thought the combined version might be a little more sophisticated, but actually turned out to not perform as well in terms of evaluator score. So we've got a method that at least has some success at generating some of these structures from a noisy sample. We then want to be able to identify these components that make up the structure and encode the constraints that satisfy it. So what affordance of components satisfy the constraints that appear in the learned and generated examples? This is what we came up with. This is a VoxML structure for build, and then some partial semantics for staircase, where you give the components the base portion, the step portion, and the top portion, and then try to infer some of the constraints that adhere across the satisfactory examples of this structure. Some of the sample approaches we came up with, we tried weighted constraint satisfaction and POM-DPs. One thing that seemed pretty fruitful was a qualitative constraint network, which tries to solve for combined qualitative spatial relations with interval algebra distinctions along an axis. We end up with something like this. This is not complete, but you can see it does capture some, where if I put something on the base, 2, it becomes part of the step. 3, I can extend the base or the step. It didn't really capture much about the top, which means this is just a partial semantics, but it gives you something, a handle with which to talk about this type of structure. And importantly, these features are not just neural network parameters, but also spatial features that can be talked about and composed independently of the network. This is the process for the whole learning method. For the first step, we actually use an MLP to just sample for the first move instead of just generating it randomly, so we don't artificially introduce the constraint where blocks are completely interchangeable. This gives you a partial relation structure, which then gets fed to a CNN, which predicts what it thinks is the most likely output structure. The output structure and the partial relation set gets fed to an LSTM, which predict the remaining set of moves needed to get there. These relations are symbolic representations that can then be actualized and operationalized using the underspecification pipeline I discussed earlier, where you can place objects touching in the appropriate direction or further from or close to other objects. Then you prune to choose your best move. That creates a new partial relation set, which is then that this process repeats until you run out of objects. Our last challenge is transfer learning. And situatedness is particularly useful for transfer learning because similar concepts often exist in similar situations. So I could take a random assortment of objects and say, build a staircase out of these, and it should try to reproduce the structure. Or put all of those collection of boxes or some objects into a space, and it can try and solve that problem. We can associate affordances with abstract properties. So if I can say that spheres roll, then sphere-like entities probably do as well. And this informs the way that you can talk about items in real or virtual situations. So let's go back to the question of what am I pointing at? If the agent doesn't have the complete knowledge of what all the objects are, but it has knowledge about how to associate them, it can say, I don't know what that thing is, but it looks like a container or something that rolls. And it gives you a handle to talk about that new object when it comes up in conversation again. So similar objects have similar habitats and affordances. So what happens when an agent like Diana encounters a novel object? This part I have to be a little bit cagey about because of some other papers that are under review. But we exploit the correlations between habitats and affordances over known objects and then map those correspondences to novel objects. We took our standard vocabulary that we've been using for some years of 17 distinct VoxML objects. This gave us 22 approximately distinct affordance encodings. So you look something like this, where you have a habitat. An object has an upward alignment and an inherent top. And then it also has an affordance such that if you put something in that object object contains that thing. From this data, we trained 200-dimensional habitat or affordance embeddings using a skipgram model to turn this sparse data set into something that we could actually work with in vector space. We represent objects as averaged habitat or affordance vectors. We tried two architectures, a 7-layer MLP as a baseline and a 4-layer CNN with 1D convolutions. We evaluate against a ground truth of k-means clustered objects derived from human annotation. We achieved about an 80% accuracy with the predicted object clustering with the ground truth object. And about 40% of the time, the predicted object always clusters with the ground truth object in over 5 randomized trials. In general, we observe that the habitat-based model is typically better at capturing common behaviors to all objects like grasping, whereas the affordance-based model seems to be better at capturing some object-specific behaviors like rolling that don't occur across the entire data set. And I'll just show a video of how this actually works in action.
I'm ready to go.
What is this?
That's a cup.
Grab it.
Should I grasp it like this?
So this is the same
How about
affordance
like this?
Yes.
grasping pipeline that I showed earlier.
Is there a gesture for that?
And this bottle here is something that we recognize, but Dyna actually has no semantics.
Please hold your
associated
new
with.
gesture still and let me commit it to memory. Okay.
Let go of the cup.
Okay. Okay. Okay, never mind.
What is that?
I don't know what it's called, but I can grasp it like a cup.
Grab it.
Okay.
So she's able to transfer the way she grasps a cup to this novel object that she's never seen before by virtue of recognizing some correspondences between those two objects. So situated grounding goes beyond visual grounding. It demonstrates meaning multimodally. It is environmentally aware in that each additional modality provides a way to probe other models. There are many methods of encoding context, both quantitatively and qualitatively, and we're developing a rich model of multimodal contextual parsing. It provides a model to accommodate both neural and symbolic representations. In this, it bridges the data modeling gap and makes it adaptable to different tasks. And in an era where you have bigger and bigger neural nets that take more and more power and more resources, we feel this provides a sustainable way to toward more powerful AI. We're working on transferring these techniques from virtual environments to real-world robotics. I'll show a little video here. This is a very similar environment where I can use gesture and language to interact with a robot.
Turn left.
Shown here in a gazebo simulator in the bottom left.
Okay, turning.
I can use gesture to
I
both
finished.
communicate with the robot and manipulate the environment.
Go here.
Okay. Okay, I'm here.
I can now do a sort of swipe gesture to
Go
change
to
the
that
camera
one.
view. I'm now viewing things through the
Okay.
robot's perspective with an omniscient view over on the left side. And when I say go here, go to that one, the robot can situate those coordinates and objects directly in the space and navigate toward them.
Okay, I'm here.
Okay, now I should address the elephant in the room. I gave a bunch of examples from GPT-2, and as we know, something happened recently. GPT-3 came out, and it's been doing all sorts of incredible things with language generation and question answering. So who needs this situated grounding stuff anyway? Rest assured, if you play around with it a bit, there are some things that GPT-3, despite its enormous size, still can't quite do. And so we feel there's still a lot of room for hybrid methods where you weld distributed and neural representations with cached out knowledge and symbolic representations. I would like to thank the following groups: Brandeis University, Colorado State University, collaborators at University of Florida and at SIFT, and DARPA for funding this research. Great list of people, great help, many research assistants and collaborators. And thank you. I'd like now to take questions.
Thank you, Nikhil. So we do have a couple questions on the Slack channel. First, just a comment. Glad to see your cat make a brief appearance. And then the first, okay, yeah, so I had a question about the data you mentioned for the multimodal simulations. You mentioned annotations on these images, and I was wondering what those annotations were exactly. Was it the like lambda calculus, or was it just the entities?
Right. So this was in the first section with the
exactly.
Yeah. So so the data is actually videos. So those are generated videos of events and objects, just objects moving in isolation. And so they're regenerated for a given input, generated 3 videos with different values for the underspecified parameters. Then each of those videos in a mTurk task were shown to a number of annotators where they were either given a video and told to choose the best caption, one of which was the ground truth, or they were given a single caption and chose to and had to choose which video they thought best described that caption.
Okay. So something
and
quite
so
different.
that gave us data to train the neural network on, which then allows us to generate subsequent simulations.
Okay, and so follow-up question, is that data set publicly available?
It is. It's on, yes, it's on GitHub. I will find the exact URL
Okay, cool.
and I can post it to the Slack channel.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you. Okay, so another question. This is an interesting point from Matt Clank. Most gestures are not for mirroring purposes, such as move a little to the left gesture, but then other gestures are about actual grips. How does the agent decide if it is learning a mirroring gesture or exploration to decide if changing pose in a particular way corresponds to moving left?
Right, okay. So the current gesture learning that's only done is only learns gestures for mirroring, and that it can learn, that's just because the implementation basically only learns gestures for grasp this new object. But when you have a context that basically what's left out is an action instead of an object, then that should tell the agent that the gesture signals some kind of event. So if we think of, try to think of an example here on the fly, if the agent has a very underspecified representation of, say, move, and I point to an object and I say, move it, and she says, where should I move it? And then I do something like this. Let's assume she doesn't know this gesture. If she could learn that, then the outstanding semantics is basically an action, which should tell her that what you're learning is something to do with this object, an action to perform, rather than just a gesture that I want you to mirror.
Okay. Oh, good. We have actually some more questions. So another question, this one from Shawali. Why do you need relational classification with CNN? How do you get the data?
So the data in that slide, it's a little small. I can't really see it. The data is represented as basically block-to-block relations. So like block 3 left of block 6. So the relations are basically just that middle term there, that predicate. And then we chose the CNN with 1D convolutions, has demonstrated some utility in text classification and for basically for image classification. And so we thought we would try it. It was sufficient at narrowing the search space somewhat, not totally, and I think it was a decent approach to try at the time. I'm definitely looking for other approaches to work on right now. Starting to approach this question again, actually using reinforcement learning to see if we can perform reinforcement learning approaches with smaller data.
Okay, very good. I think we have time for just one more. This one from Hillary Harner. How much do the agent's body limitations impact their understanding of an object's affordances? Makes sense to try to pick up a bottle like a cup. They're both round, hand-sized objects. But what about a big steel drum? Round, but not hand-size. Sorry if I missed an answer to this question in the talk.
Right. So no, that's a very good point. So I have to go like way back to one thing that I didn't really talk about that is actually encoded. So we encode a couple of things about the embodiment of the object relative to the agent. And so a cup here, it's typically smaller than the agent is assumed to be human size. And we assume that it's movable. A drum would be possibly movable, but also could be larger than the agent. And so there's a place where it should be able to determine a correlation between these embodiment parameters and the ability to move or not move an object. This also in the paper, I didn't really discuss this. We do a grasp pose estimation to determine how the hand should fall when actually grasping the object. And when running that algorithm, it would become very clear trying to extend the fingers to make coverage of the object that you can't extend the fingers that far when the object is so much bigger than the hand.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, so we're